In March of 1933, that's 88 years ago, I don't know if anybody here is that old, Franklin Delano Roosevelt began the first of his 4 terms as president. The Depression, which affected members of my grandparents and stuff, it put 1/4 of the nation out of work. Things were depressed, food lines and so forth everywhere. And FDR began his speech by saying this: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. We would ask ourselves now, 88 years later, what do we fear today in our own country? Is there any sense of that? Do we fear the Taliban, who so recently viciously attacked some of our departing military in a bombing attack in Kabul? Are we afraid of the COVID variants, not just COVID, SARS-19, but the Delta variant? Now there's one called the Mu. God speaks to us this evening through the prophet Isaiah. He's describing miracles, cures, and healings among his chosen Hebrew people. He talks about the blind, the deaf, the mute, the paralyzed. He promises a rehabilitation, a memory. Now, even Mother Nature will be transformed for them in the future as he lifts the morale. Water flows in the desert. Parched lands became very lush. But when Isaiah is speaking for God, or God through him, these miracles, they're rather imaginative, were meant to be serious, but they were powerful signs of something more. Not just to raise morale, remove fear and worry, but to look at the real issues the chosen people were facing that would terrify them. So it wasn't just physical disorders and diseases, but more about the global disorder that just destroyed them. When Isaiah was speaking, the listeners had even worse problems than the physical handicaps. It's nice to get cured of paralysis, but there's something worse when you have no home to live in or no country. They were captured and exiled peoples by foreigners. The enemy came in, invaded their territory, destroyed their city, took many captives, and just ruined their civilization. The world was like coming to an end. That's the real illness they feared. Jesus then, in the gospel we just heard, does a little bit of that. He repeats some of these physical cures in one particular client. And in fact, in the Gospels, he'll do this several times to certain people. He'll include the curing of lepers. 3 times he'll raise someone who died and bring him back to life. So the people said today, when he did this with this gentleman, he makes the deaf hear and the mute to speak, as though he's fulfilling something long ago promised in the past. But again, is it just about physical remedies? The people were astounded. They just could not keep the experience to themselves. The more he told them to say this to nobody, the more they spread the word and said, he has done all things well. But this is not all. There is more, both in Isaiah and the gospel for us tonight. Because Isaiah promised that God would come day complete something. Jesus was born of Mary, came into the world to complete what Isaiah said was divine vindication. Powerful word. Divine vindication means God's victory over everything, over the whole human race, and all our ills and other global disorders. So people who are religious, yes, we want to have a healthy body. We want our children to grow up healthy and strong. We want a long life. Those are good natural wishes and prayers. But we are religious people like our ancestors, the Hebrews, looking for more from God. What does divine vindication look like when it happens? One of the phrases he used was that here comes divine vindication, your God comes to save you. You hear that word salvation, save. If you were saved by God, would you know it? What would it look like for that to happen? If the whole human race was saved, what would that look like in the mind of God? So divine vindication, a big word, means more than just the physical cures and miracles, which spur us on, raise morale, increase hope, but they mean something further. Divine vindication happens on a more global level when people who live in society treat each other fairly and justly. That's asking a lot. Divine vindication happens when society does not ignore people who do have handicaps, disabilities. And also the people, whether you are born or unborn, divine vindication embraces that. What happened recently in the state of Texas by the U.S. Supreme Court, we'll see where that's going to lead to. But it disturbs a lot of people who reject that kind of divine vindication. And divine vindication also overcomes any kind of, St. James said, partiality, inequality, favorites above the unfavorites, between poor and rich, the haves, the have-nots. And that's how St. James put it today. He's the apostle who was the first bishop of the Jerusalem church, so he writes very early, the infancy of the Christian people. And he says to them tonight, as the reading was read, very clear, you don't need a long sermon on this, he tells them in the Jerusalem church that there were problems when they came to the assembly, when they came to Mass, if you will, on a Sunday or a vigil like tonight. He saw the disparity there, and it really upset him. They were not equal. They were rich and they were poor, and they made their presence felt. He says, do not make distinctions among yourselves between those who have and those who have not. Do not be judgmental with evil designs that tend to discriminate people, some who have power and some who have not. So, the real healing in society, which includes all kinds of physical impairments, has to rise to the highest level. The real healing has to be the remedy for all social ills that plague every nation worse than a organic pandemic. God intends to save the human race, what might mean, in my words, to elevate every society. It's not a dream, it's not the Wizard of Oz or something magical, to elevate it by calling us and transforming us to be a different kind of individual, one at a time. That's how he'll convert the human race. So now we are the Jerusalem church here, and we are citizens of this nation, so it's our turn to try to incorporate these great values as called, to demonstrate by our actions our concern for others, especially those who have less than we have. So Jesus is inviting us tonight, and he does this throughout the year, to invite us to participate in his continuous work of healing the human race from the blindnesses, the deafness, the muteness that often forces people or just inhibits them to ignore the dispossessed and the vulnerable. They don't see that. Okay, then the critical issue would be on different levels. With Jesus, we have to show a preference, and it may be very hard because we have our own biases too, a preference for those who need our help in any way. One of the majesties of the great parable, you know this by heart, the Good Samaritan, Jesus is challenged to say, well, who am I obliged to help in life? The people who belong to my own country or to my ethnic group? You know, should I, Father Duffy, take care of only those of Irish descent, or only the Catholics, you know, so forth like that. Tribalism and so forth. Will we break those barriers down? So a preference for anybody, for example, the unemployed, and with the COVID thing, many people have lost their businesses and so forth. The lonely could be for any kind of reason, even the imprisoned. You know, I was a prison chaplain for many years, and it's one of my worst missions because it was so depressing, because many of them deserve what they did, but it's not a happy place, and there's a certain kind of loneliness. Plus people who are homebound. There are homeless people still. There always will be. The poor, Jesus says, you will always have. About the elderly, as the people age with advanced age, certain impairments appear there, also in their memory loss. The unborn, we mentioned that. They're not excluded from the concern. The poorest of the poor. You know, when many bishops in the USA and many politicians in Congress and the Senate were saying, we got to take care of the poor in the USA, and Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, the late cardinal, said, you know, the poorest of the poor would be the unborn. They have no right to vote. No one speaks for them. They don't march in the streets and protest, and yet they're people. And also we include the immigrant, the refugee, with all those political problems that go with it. So things are very messy, but they always have been since St. James wrote this letter. They were always there since Isaiah was told by God how to speak to his chosen people. So as we think about this and meditate on this, and this gorgeous Labor Day weekend, which means the opposite of labor, I hope, for you. I got to work this weekend, you're free. St. James says this so. He reminds us, he boosts us up. He wants the Jerusalem church, he wants our church also to be mindful of that. He says, God promises his kingdom to those who love him. And those who love him are the ones who can see himself, God, in the face of the poor.